let's go ahead and get started with the first story here. We're going to start off by discussing what is happening with this conflict between Russia and Ukraine. So I feel like every week there is more news about this war. But what I'm about to tell you right now really needs to give you pause. And I don't want to hear it from people who were basically saying this was a waste of time to focus on this, from people who were telling me that this is not important and we shouldn't be focusing on it. Because Richard Medhurst actually tweeted this, and then I dove in a little bit further. He was the one who brought this to my attention, and I think you all need to take a look at this. Breaking news. Russia has just inked a deal to place tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. We are inching closer to nuclear war with Russia, and there will be no going back. But yeah, keep sending weapons and F-16s. Let's just send Ukraine our own while we're at it. Why not? This tweet actually received over 100,000 views, which is good. So that means that more people are paying attention to it. But Russia is making moves, and they have already decided to move nuclear weapons to Belarus. I have a video clip I want to show you, and then I have an article I'm going to get into as well, because we tried to warn people that the last thing we need in reference to this war is any type of escalation. And this is exactly what is happening. So it was really interesting to me, the number of people who told me we should not focus on these anti-war rallies, or that it's not that important, that we should focus more on a presidential candidate. And what people have to understand is that presidential candidates, Medicare for all of these issues that a lot of us are continuing to fight for, none of these things matter if we're all dead because of a nuclear war. Let's get into this clip here from Sky News.
Joining me now, military analyst, retired Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell. Sean, great to see you. Talk us through just what happened. We learned about this yesterday, and how significant it is that they're going to be stationing these weapons there in Belarus.
Sounds quite alarming whenever we're talking about nuclear weapons, the rhetoric. In addition to signing the deal and, of course, those extra aircraft, they're also positioning Iskander missiles, which are capable of carrying the warheads. And, of course, Russia's got to find storage facilities in Belarus. They're going to build those. They'll be ready by July. But it's worth remembering that these weapons will still be under Russian control, even though they're forward deployed.
Okay, so we're going to pause here for a second, because I just want to show you the map. So here is Russia. Over here to the right, here is Ukraine. Down here, here's Kyiv, and here is Belarus. You see why this is so concerning? Let's go on.
I'm old enough and ugly enough. The former Soviet Union, when it was around, when it collapsed, a lot of the weapons, the nuclear weapons, were forward deployed. And by 1996, weapons that had been deployed in Belarus, Kazakhstan and Ukraine were all back on Russian soil again. So actually, this move of forward deploying it to Belarus is just reversing that trend. It's also worth noting the Americans say they're monitoring the situation, but they say there's no evidence whatsoever that Russia is planning to use nuclear weapons.
Interesting sort of relaxed response. I'm sure the Poles will be wondering a little bit more nervously about things like that. Talk us through, though, some...
Yeah, he mentioned it was a relaxed response. I don't think this should be a relaxed response. Not at this point in time. Because to me, this is just showing you again, this is escalating this war. This war is not de-escalating, it's escalating. And at one point in time, there was a meeting, this was a couple weeks ago, we covered this. There was a meeting with Xi Jinping and with Putin to talk about some type of peace negotiation. I don't know what happened with that. I don't know where that went. But then after that story, remember, it was just maybe a week or two ago that I explained to you that there was an attack on the Kremlin, which essentially would be similar to an attack on the White House. So you have to understand the importance and the significance of that. And now here we are.
Some of the other thought processes, what else is happening behind the scenes to lead to this decision by the Russians?
Well, Russia has a huge nuclear arsenal. It's got nearly 6,000 nuclear weapons. They can blow the world up several times over. They can be launched from air, land or sea, from the bombers there, from submarines or from land base. And of course, over the years, it's become less worried about range. They use intercontinental ballistic missiles, so they can be based anywhere. So the fact that they're forward deploying these is actually irrelevant from a military perspective. So this is almost certainly about messaging. It's worth remembering Russia is not doing well in the war in Ukraine. There's a bit of saber rattling. But if we look back to this month's visit by Xi Jinping, he made very, very clear to Putin at the time, this is, it's not about, he should not deploy or use nuclear weapons in this conflict. So I think actually the bigger worry here is almost certainly for Belarus, bizarrely, because Russia's made really clear, Putin certainly, he wants to re-assimilate Belarus back into the former Russian Empire. They've been deploying troops forward. They've been mounting operations out of Belarus. They've now got aircraft out of Belarus, and they're now looking at mounting tactical nuclear weapons there. So it's a real worrying sign, I think, for Belarus.
Did you guys notice that he said that Russia is not doing well in this war, but they don't continue to tell you that also Ukraine is not doing well in this war either? They are continuing to push this narrative to convince people that Ukraine is winning this, and they're not. If they were winning it, let's use common sense here, people. If they were winning, the United States government wouldn't have to continue to send them weapons and aid. And that's continuing. We just talked about the G7 summit where Zelensky was there and he was asking for more aid, and Joe Biden agreed to give him more weapons and more aid. So if they were doing so well, they wouldn't need to continue to ask for help. Let's remember what they said about fighting until the last Ukrainian. That means until everyone's dead. And more people need to push back on that. The way that people just go along with these talking points, the fact that these two commentators are discussing this as calmly as they are, that is very concerning for me.
Also, is there an aspect that Vladimir Putin's making this announcement for his domestic audience?
Almost certainly. I mean, yesterday, this interview, it was on a state-owned TV channel, so it was all carefully managed. Very confident Putin talking about the West will never be able to sustain its level of support. And also, we're going to have 1,600 brand new main battle tanks in Russian hands by the end of the year. But if you look at the facts behind that, US economy is 10 times the size of Russia. The collective UK, France, Germany is 5 times the size of Russian. And therefore, it's easily got the capacity. And
no, this part right here, let's go back to what he just said. Listen to this.
But if you look at the facts behind that, US economy is 10 times the size of Russia. The collective UK, France, Germany is 5 times.
He just mentioned Germany, right? What did I just tell you about Germany last night? Germany just announced yesterday morning they have entered a recession. So I don't even know why he's mentioning Germany. Yes, Germany has the 4th largest economy in the world, but they just announced they're going into a recession. He mentioned the UK. People in the UK can't even afford to pay for heat. You see what is it? Now we're going into the warmer months, but people in the UK have been struggling economically since the start of this war. And the way that they're talking about this, they're making it seem like these countries are doing so well. He also mentions France. Didn't we talk about how many times for the past couple of weeks, all the people protesting in France against Macron's pension reform? The people in France are out in the streets. They're not thinking about helping you fight your war. But the way he just mentions these countries as if they're so stable and strong right now, and they're not.
The size of Russian, and therefore it's easily got the capacity. And in terms of how they're going to build the tanks, Russia's only factory building tanks can build 20 a month. They're losing 150 a month. It's very difficult to see how they'll do the maths. And even Russian commentators are turning around and saying they're going to have to open the cupboards, bring more out of storage, and even potentially bring the T-34 out of storage. That's when 1940s, that was first brought into service, has no place on the battlefield whatsoever. Shahed 136 drones, 71 used from Iran. Big pauses because Russia's running out. And I think despite the rhetoric that Putin's coming out with, Russian industry is struggling. And Russia is increasingly reliant on its importing weapons from its few friends.
And so is Ukraine. You see the problem with the talking points? He said that Russia is relying for importing weapons from its friends, but Ukraine is relying on weapons to come from its friends too. Russia has a friend called China. Ukraine does not. You have to remember, Russia is a part of BRICS. You don't think, like, if this pops off, you don't think that Putin can't just go to Xi Jinping and say, I need some help. Then what? Then what? They're talking about this like this is no big deal as we're moving closer and closer towards the possibility of a World War III. And that would be an absolute disaster. The way they just spew this, like the narrative. This is why I wanted you to hear this. It's not just American mainstream media that's doing this. Even Sky News, they're all in on it.
Just quickly going back to this timing of this decision to say they're going to station these weapons in Belarus. Any surprise that it came after he'd met with President Xi? Something that President Xi would have said, yes, OK, you can have my tacit approval to do something like that? I
think it's much simpler than that, to be brutally honest. I think we've seen on the battlefield that Putin's going from offense to defense. He would have hoped to have got further, particularly around Bakhmut. And I think now he's really worried about what Ukraine is going to do on their counterattack. And therefore, he's trying to saber rattle to try and scare the Western community, because without Western aid, Ukraine's counteroffensive would be very difficult to mount.
Really interesting. Sean, as always.
You know, they can try to sleep on Putin if they want to. He's saying that he's playing defense and not offense. You don't know what he has planned. You know, you never, tell your right hand what your left hand is doing. Obviously, it's not like he's going to come forward and say, oh, by the way, and I'm planning this, this, and this. No, like, he's not stupid. Sleep on him if you want to. Now, The Guardian also wrote about this. I want to talk about this article a little bit. It says Russia moving nuclear warheads to Belarus, says dictator Lukashenko. Listen to this. The Belarusian ruler, Alexander Lukashenko, has said that Russia has begun moving tactical nuclear warheads for storage to Belarus, adding that it was possible that the weapons had already arrived in his country. We had to prepare storage facilities and the rest over there in Belarus. We've done all of that. This is why the relocation of nuclear munitions began. That's coming from Lukashenko. He was asked if the weapons had already arrived, and he said, maybe. I will go and take a look. Highlight this. Maybe I will go and take a look. He doesn't even know. Like, they are just being so nonchalant about this. It is disturbing. I don't know. Do you know if there's any nuclear weapons in your country that's another country has brought in? I don't know. Let me go check. It's not like you're checking on a roast in the oven to see if it's done. You see what I mean? They're just so casual about this. The remarks came hours after Russian and Belarusian military officials signed a pact that provides for Moscow to deploy tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus, marking a shift in the Kremlin's nuclear posture that could raise the stakes of any future instability in Belarus. The plan to deploy tactical nuclear weapons on foreign soil is Russia's first since 1991. The Kremlin has defended the decision, saying that it is being provoked by Western powers supporting Ukraine. In other words, us. They feel they're being provoked by the U.S. government. And yeah, you can add the other countries in as well. You could say UK, France, Germany, yada, yada. But at the meat of it, at the root of it all, is the U.S. government. Those other countries like France and UK and Germany, they are following our lead. Germany didn't decide to send Leopard tanks into Ukraine until they got the lead from the U.S. government, until Biden decided to send tanks to Ukraine. Then Germany decided, okay, well, we'll do the same thing. They're not acting alone. They're following us. And this is one of the reasons why Macron mentioned that maybe some of us European countries should not continue to follow the U.S. government lead. Maybe we should have our own, Western power and not follow them in reference to this conflict, this tension that the US government has between the conflict between China and Taiwan. Now, Macron can't handle his own country right now, and he has his own issues that he needs to deal with in France. But he did have a point about that. When is it okay for an ally, a Western ally, to push back and say, I am not in agreement with you on this particular issue? And if they do that, will they remain an ally? Russia has said it will maintain control over the tactical nuclear weapons, which may be launched on Iskander-M missiles or from Su-25 planes, both of which Belarus has in its arsenal. Belarus borders 3 NATO countries and has missiles that could reach several capitals. The U.S. also has about 100 such weapons stationed at bases around Europe. Notice they stress this, stationed at bases around Europe, because the United States government has over 800 military bases around the world. The transfer would further align Russia and Belarus militaries as Russia seeks a closer alliance with Minsk, which some have predicted will lead to Belarus's loss of sovereignty. The Russian defense minister, Sergei, said the two countries would look for other ways to integrate their militaries. That decision came as Russia is bracing itself for a potential Ukrainian counterattack that could put Moscow on the defensive in its 15-month-old war. The head of the Wagner Group said his Russian paramilitary organization had begun to withdraw from the city of Bakhmut and would hand all its positions over to the regular Russian army by June 1st. And there we can see one of the tanks there. And then I want to go to this piece right here. Ukraine's deputy defense minister said on Thursday that Russia had begun to replace Wagner units with regular troops on the outskirts of Bakhmut, but that Wagner fighters remained inside the city. So again, I just want to remind you, we're only hearing one side of the story here. This is coming from Ukraine's deputy defense minister. We don't know if that's true or not because we haven't heard the other side. There's two sides to a story. And notice they tend to quote and reference what's happening with this war in reference to people that are in Ukraine, on the Ukraine side. So you're hearing their side of the story. A lot of times we're not hearing from journalists, right, and other politicians in Russia to hear their side of the story. So that's important to note. Russia recently claimed to have finally captured the city after nearly 250 days of fighting, a statement Kyiv disputes. Most analysts expect Ukraine to launch a counterattack, potentially threatening the Russian military's hard-fought gains in Bakhmut and other areas of the front. So again, notice how they frame it. See, when they tell you something that Russia said, notice how they're willing to jump in and say that, well, Kyiv disputes that. But when it's the other way around, they don't. They just say, well, Ukraine said this, but they don't come in and tell you that Russia has disputed what Ukraine is saying. A Ukrainian official on Thursday suggested the counteroffensive would not mark a significant shift of gear. This is not a single event that will begin at a specific hour of a specific day with a solemn cutting of the red ribbon. That's coming from Podolak, who is the presidential advisor. Russian militias aligned with Ukraine also launched a cross-border raid earlier this week, setting up chaotic battles in the Belgorod region in some of the first sustained fighting on Russian territory since the beginning of the war. Ukraine has denied any connection to the fighters. See? Anything to make Ukraine look good. So the narrative is important, but this is very concerning. I hope more people cover this. I had warnings about people that this is actually, we're going into an escalation of this war. And I want to play this again for those of you who just joined, what Claire Daly had to say. Now, she's been very vocal about this war and all wars, honestly. about how we need to have some type of call for peace. But even nowadays, even if you say that, people will smear you and call you a Putin puppet, because how dare you call for peace? Why would you do that? Because that doesn't help the military industrial complex. And there's a lot of money to be made in war. There's a lot of profit to be made here. And we have to remember, the goal is not necessarily to win. The goal is to have a never-ending war and continuing to funnel money. Julian Assange woke us up to this a while back. But Claire is 100% correct here.
Thanks very much, President. So here we are, and the corks must be popping in the arms industry boardrooms all over Europe. A plan rushed through behind closed doors, no public consultation, no public debate, presented as a fait accompli, just waiting for our rubber stamp. A unilateral declaration by an unelected commissioner that Europe is now a war economy. Not a war on poverty or homelessness or on climate change, but a diktat to the public of Europe that they have to accept another 1 billion euros being laundered from their pockets into the fat wallets of the global arms industry.
Notice she mentions the profit to be made here, right? So that piece is important. More people need to say that. Our politicians should be calling that out. Our politicians in DC should stress the amount of profit that is to be made here and what this is really all about.
The workers in those factories have to suck up the suspension of the Working Time Act, and if they don't, they'll be brandished as traitors or Kremlin agents. And if that wasn't bad enough, it won't be just our arms industries, because our friends in the US and Israel can dip into the pot, flog off bits to their European counterparts who'll do the final assembly, put a stamp and a premium on it, and it's champagne all round. And why wouldn't it be? At 3,000 to 4,000 euro per shell, and the workers of Europe are expected to pay for 1 million of them. It's absolutely outrageous. If you really cared about Ukraine, you'd be pushing for peace. But the EU hasn't lifted a finger to push for peace in Ukraine.
That's because, and the reason why the EU hasn't pushed for peace in Ukraine is because, once again, they follow the lead of the US government. So in order for there to be a push for peace, it would have to come from the White House first. And then the other countries that are our allies would get on board. But she's correct.
Ukraine. In fact, it's done everything to escalate the conflict and prevent peace. Because for the EU, it's all about the war profiteers. And the catastrophe in Ukraine is nothing more than a global opportunity for your friends. It's an absolute disgrace. It's about time you started to work for peace.
She's right. 100%. It is a disgrace. And what is going to happen to Ukraine when this war is over? What happens to the country? Do you think they're going to be okay economically? This country would be destroyed. They have all these investors coming in, BlackRock, willing to work with Zelensky. What is happening here? If people open their eyes and pay attention, they can see what this is really about. This is a hustle. This is a hustle. And any of you that have had a hustle, any type of side hustle, you know one when you see one. You mean to tell me you're fighting for your life? People in Ukraine, that you guys are fighting for your lives. And at the same time, Zelensky is over here making deals with companies like BlackRock to come into Ukraine and set up shop. You got time to do business deals and negotiations. And people are fighting for their life. This is a hustle. And that's what you need to start calling it. It's a mess. This is a mess. But share this with people. Share this. A lot of people don't know about this. Terrible. I'm going to go to some of the comments here. Thank you for the super chat, Julia. Doobie doobie doo. Love it, Sabs. Thank you so much, Julia. Cook says they better start negotiating. Russia is serious. Hugo says the propaganda is sickening. And Mark says this is how our last war begins if we do not rein in our government by MIC. It's crazy, man. Most people have no idea what's going on.